Me again, back for another video lesson. We're outside this time. Probably can't really tell, but we are. I promise I'm not lying. No bobcat though, it's kind of lonely. Oh my god, if that dog barks this whole time, I am literally going to lose my mind. Hope you guys are doing well. Not a lot going on here. A bird killed itself on my window, so that was sad. I guess I ate a lot of bread today, so there's that. Okay, so I'm actually filming like somewhat early for once, which is awesome. However, I don't have a very good idea on how many of you truly got your assignment from yesterday turned in. So I'm gonna hold off on the shout outs, but I got you tomorrow. Then in attendance question news, the truly important stuff in my class. I'm pretty sure that mint chocolate chip is gonna defeat peanut butter. I remember that this time. Peanut butter cups. And so that will be moving on to the Elite 8. And then today's attendance question was cookie dough ice cream versus popsicles. Yes, gremlins, I know that popsicles is not technically ice cream, but this was my gift to people who might like popsicles but don't like ice cream. You're welcome. But let's just jump into the lesson today. We're going to continue talking about the South in the 1800s. We're talking about Southern society today. The one thing I really want to stress for you guys was that the South was an incredibly unequal place. And I know you're like, duh, Miss Barney, that's where slavery was. And yes, duh, gremlins, I know. See, over 50% of the South's population was white, and even amongst the white Americans, there was a huge amount of inequality. So white Southerners were kind of put into three groups. The first group was the planters. These were the plantation owners. They had a lot of land, most of which was used for planting cotton. They had giant houses, best dresses, and heaps of money. They were incredibly rich, and of course they just ran things down in the South. Now, it was a very small percentage of white Southerners that were in this group, like less than 10%, and yet they were responsible for enslaving most of the people in the South. The second group were small landowners. They owned some land, they owned a few slaves, but not nearly as much as plantation owners. Third group were poor white Southerners. They owned no land, they owned no slaves. So the wealth was really unequal down there, and there were a lot of differences between the white Southerners, and yet they were banded together by racism. The other thing that banded them together was that they had a common fear. The thing that white Southerners feared above all else was a slave rebellion. This is why, like I said yesterday, slavery was an institution that was built on fear and violence to try to keep people down and oppress them. So now we'll be talking about the final group in Southern society, which was enslaved Black Americans. As we've been talking about like tensions between the North and the South increasing over slavery and about abolitionists fighting against slavery, I think it's really important that we remember what exactly these people were fighting against. So today you're going to be listening to two narratives or two stories about slavery in the South. These are both true stories, and as a warning, they are graphic.
You are Ruth, daughter of slave parents, born in Georgia in 1815. You were born in the slave quarters of Georgia cotton plantation, along with your 9 older brothers and sisters. By the age of 12, you had seen all of your siblings sold off to various plantation owners. Your mother was worked to death, and your father was rented out for months at a time. At 15, you were sold to a man who owned another cotton plantation, about 100 miles from where you were born. In the slave quarters of your new home, cabins were built to contain 2 sets of families, some with dividers and some not. Rags were stuffed into the cracks of the walls to keep the chill air, snow, or rain out. Beds were made by throwing old rags, hay, and a bit of cotton, if they were lucky enough to have it, on the floor. Children all slept together in one bed until one got married. Then they would be given part of another cabin if one was available. All children, no matter what age, stayed with their parents until married. They found a relative or friend with a small family to take them in, or until they were sold. The 2 families had to use one fireplace. In some cases, the families got along. In others, they did not. The cabin where you were placed was crowded. The family that took you in had 2 adults and 4 children, ages 2 through 10. The other family inside your cabin had 2 adults and 6 children. The 2 families were not friendly towards one another. One day, your new dad stole a hog and killed it. When he brought home the meat to share with his family, he was seen by a member of the other family. The incident was immediately reported to the overseer, who gave your father a severe flogging with a cat-o'-nine tails. The work on a cotton plantation was never ending. Before the first light of day, you were out in the fields picking cotton. You received only a few minutes a day to rest, drink, or eat a meal. Meals were never eaten sitting down. You always had to look busy. You were never allowed to leave the fields until after dark. Sometimes, on the nights with the full moon, you worked late into the night. Once back from the fields, your chores needed to be done. Slaves were allowed very small gardens outside of their cabin, which they tended themselves. Water had to be fetched, wood split for the fire, food prepared, and clothes mended. A new pair of shoes and a cotton shirt were given to the slaves once a year. After 2 years, you met a new arrival, Solomon, and you were married 6 months later. You were given a cabin to share with another couple who had 8 children. By the time you were 18, you were expecting your first child. While pregnant, you were still required to work every day in the fields. It was July, and the cotton was at least a foot high. You and the others were hoeing it for the 4th and final time this season. While you were hoeing, the overseer followed you on horseback with a whip. The fastest hoer took the row in front. Being pregnant and tired, sometimes you fell behind. When that happened, you were whipped. When you were 24 years old, you had your 3rd child, who you named Jacob. Shortly after his birth, the overseer arrived at your cabin. He told you that the master had ordered him to deliver 5 slaves to sell. Your husband Solomon was to be sold the following week. You begged to have your family sold along with him. The trader agreed to allow you and the baby to be sold, but you were forced to leave your 2 older children behind. The slave trader started off for the market, and within 2 days he had sold your baby to pay his tavern bill. A year later, on the new plantation, you and Solomon had a 4th child. Days after he was born, fearing losing another child or the child having to endure the cruelty of this new slave master, you threw yourself with your newborn into a well and drowned. You are David. For 40 years, you worked as a slave on tobacco plantations in Maryland, South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. Born into slavery in 1801, you never knew freedom. You saw great cruelties take place, not so much by the masters, but more by the overseers. The overseers you had contact with were men who were themselves slaves, but had more power. Their job was to keep things in order around the plantations. On the plantation in Maryland where you spent your first 12 years, the slaves were hardly ever whipped unless they were very lazy. The women and children were even allowed to stay inside their quarters in the very cold, snowy, or rainy weather. In South Carolina, conditions were far worse. Sold at 12, you worked on a plantation where your quarters were log huts. The tops were partly open, which let the rain and cold in. You shared your hut with several other single men. Your bed was only a board, wide enough to lay on. For a pillow, you had to use your jacket. You covered yourself with whatever you could find. This was the way single men slept. In the spring of your 19th year, you were sold to a slave trader who then sold you to a Georgia plantation owner. At 23, you married Eliza. Together, you had 2 sons. One day, an overseer saw you resting in the shade, and he delivered a most cruel punishment. He rubbed tar all over your head and face. He then set fire to it. Your head was doused with water before it could kill you, but you were left with no hair and horrible scars on your face. The pain was unbearable. You were unable to work for 2 weeks. You remained on the same plantation until the time of your master's bankruptcy, when he was forced to sell all of his slaves. You and your family were lucky to be sold together. At the time, you were 32 years old. You were bought and moved to a tobacco plantation in Virginia. Being a very large man, mature, and very ugly from your scars, your new owner thought you would make a great overseer. You had a family, so he could control you. You were so big and so ugly that everyone would be afraid of you. You never had a choice. Life was very difficult. One of the master's sons was the driver. He always came to the field to make sure you were working the others hard enough. Many times, he hid in the fields and watched you. If he thought you were not working the field hands hard enough, he would call you over to him and tell you to beat one of them. If you refused, he would threaten to beat one of your children or your wife. Daily, you were forced to whip and torture your fellow slaves. One slave who had been caught stealing was sent to you for punishment. The master ordered you to pull each of his fingernails off. One day, a slave trader had come to the plantation. You were ordered to make ready 3 older slave men. You were told to take them in the back and pluck out any gray hairs, rub their faces with grease-soaked towels, and then bring them forward as 3 young men. It was either do this or your children would be sold instead. After the fall harvest one year, a young slave man tried to run away. When he was caught, he was given a good dinner. In the morning, you were told to tie his hands to a rail and bind his feet. The master came and gave the runaway 50 lashes across the back. His son, the driver, issued 50 lashes, and you were ordered to deliver 50 lashes. When the man asked for water, you were told to pour the water down his back, the location of his wounds. That same day, you took him to the blacksmith shop and had 2 large bars of iron bent around his feet. Each bar weighed 20 pounds. You also had a chain fastened around his neck. These remained on the man for months. For 8 years, you remained the overseer. You had no friends. Your wife and children had none either because you were hated as much, if not more, than the master. During a slave revolt, you and your family were killed. You were 40.
Situations like these didn't happen to every single enslaved person, but these situations were not uncommon. I hope you were kind of reminded on just how awful slavery was. Now, I do want to emphasize, though, despite the unspeakable things that happened to enslaved people, their humanity was not stripped from them. Enslaved Black Americans created a rich and vibrant culture between them that honestly has had a massive impact on American culture in general. And then enslaved people never stopped resisting in big and small ways against their enslavers. As a whole, enslaved people never really just laid down and took what was happening to them. They kept fighting against it. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. Okay guys, so now you have a short little quiz to go answer on this video. So I'll be back with another video lesson for you tomorrow. And hopefully I will have my bobcat with me. Bye.